go over experiential learning theory and teaching style. So John Dewey popularized experiential learning, and then Kolb took that and created a model from it. And Kolb said that you'll have an experience, you reflect, make observations of that experience. Then you conceptualize it, you link it to other concepts that you know or that are known. You create a hypothesis, and then you act out on that and test it. Now, even if you fail, that creates a new experience that you can reflect on, conceptualize, and then retry. It's kind of like engineers or inventors that create something. They often fail quite often, but they learn something from that failure. They're not afraid to fail. And they continue that process until they eventually learn from their prior experiences and get the product they want. So think in terms of dangerous fields, experiential learning is extremely useful for. Think of a pilot learning from a more experienced pilot. You wouldn't want to go out and teach yourself to fly in fields that can have an element of risk. You want to learn from somebody that has prior experience so you don't make the mistakes or make fatal mistakes that could hurt yourself or hurt other people. Think of the medical field where you would have a doctor in training. They go through clinicals. They get to practice different procedures on a mannequin that could be risky to a real person. And then once they learn from their mistakes and no longer make fatal mistakes or risky mistakes, then they can graduate to working on a patient, and eventually through years of training and learning from their experience, they can go start their own practice. So anything with an element of risk, experiential learning is extremely valuable. And think of internships and apprenticeships. It doesn't mean that you have to learn from somebody else. You could be learning from your own experience. An apprenticeship, you're paired with an expert in the field, much like the pilot example or the doctor example. An internship doesn't always mean that you're paired with an expert in the field. You may be working in a career field that you're interested in, but you may not be paired up with anybody, but you're still learning from your own experience. You're going out, you're learning what it takes to perform this job, to do well in that career. That is experiential learning. It's the reason it's one of my favorite methods of teaching and learning for myself. So now let's look at zone of proximal development. We talked about this in social learning. There are things that you can do independently, that you have enough experience. Let's think of this in terms of experiential learning for a sec. Things that you have enough experience where you can do that yourself. You don't need any help from anybody else. Then there are things that you don't necessarily have enough experience to do on your own, but you do have enough experience when paired with a peer that you can perform. Or maybe your group members are not enough and you need help from the teacher, but with that help from the teacher, you can pull this off, you can learn this knowledge or perform this action. And then there are things that you just don't have enough experience to do yet. You'll get there, and that's where grit comes in, determination. You keep trying. That's where motivation and effort plays a role. Just because you can't do it right away, just because you don't have enough experience yet, eventually, through trial and error, through failure, you'll learn from that, and eventually you'll get to the point where you can pull that off. So that was zone of proximal development. That was the link to experiential learning. Now let's look at Kolb's model in relation to those three. You have a concrete experience, right? You go out, you have a new experience, you reflect, you make observations on that. You might have enough experience to pull this off yourself. Maybe you still need help from a teacher or peer. Maybe you can't do that yet, but you still make observations on it to see where you're at, to analyze the experience. Then you conceptualize. Maybe you have enough knowledge and you can link this to prior knowledge and make sense of it, to make use of it. Maybe you can't do that by yourself. You need help from others, but eventually with that help, you can pull this off. You can connect those ideas. Maybe it's just too complicated. You're not there yet, but eventually you'll get there as long as you keep trying. Now you form a hypothesis. Maybe you can form that on your own because you have enough experience. Maybe you need assistance from teachers or peers. Maybe you need to discuss this with others in your group, and y'all create a well-developed hypothesis that you can test. Maybe you're not there yet. Even through reflection and observation, through connecting ideas, you just don't have enough experience, and so you try it out, you fail, but you keep trying. And that creates a new experience, and you go through this process all over again. Eventually, with enough cycles of this model, you'll eventually learn from those failures, and maybe it'll take you out of this stage, if that's where you're at, and bring you down to one of these two, where your peers can help you, and they give you that aha, eureka moment. Or maybe just through enough failure, you can eventually get enough experience to do it yourself. That's how these are interconnected: zone of proximal development and experiential learning. Now let's look at active learning and why I have activities in the class. This is a theoretical class. We're covering theoretical concepts, educational theories that I was able to use in my education, that I was able to apply, that I found useful to learn new and novel information. So I'm passing that on through my experience to you. That's experiential learning. Now, research has shown that if somebody only reads about something, they'll remember about 10% of what they read. About 20% of what they listen to. So if you were just listening to this on a podcast, you might retain about 20% of it. If you were able to see components, that's the reason I have these visual aids, or if you were in a face-to-face class, I draw it out. That'll help you retain more. If you see and hear, remember, reflect back to multiple intelligence theory, learning style, when I said most people are multimodal and most people are visual auditory, seeing and hearing. They'll retain about 50%. If you have to give a speech on it, talk about it, teach it, and write about it, 70%. That's the reason we have our discussions at the end of the class session. So you have to reflect on what you experienced in class. And that's the reason I have your videos, where you have to narrate that video and explain how that theoretical concept was linked to the activity. But look at this, 90% of what you do, not only in the creation of the video, in the writing of what you reflected on, but the actual performance of applying that theoretical concept to something physical, that kinesthetic element. 90% retain the things that they actually perform, the things that they actually do. Now let's look at this in terms of Bloom's taxonomy. Memorization and understanding, considered passive learning. Now, once you get up to application, if you can apply, now we're on the border between passive and active. We're getting up there in the upper levels of learning of Bloom's taxonomy. If you can analyze and evaluate what you've done, maybe you had to edit the video, maybe you had to write the discussion, maybe you had to edit the discussion before it went into the writing sample, you had to create an illustration. All of those involved analysis, evaluation, and creation to get you to the upper levels of learning. That's why I have activities built into the course. Let's scroll down. Let's look at teaching style. Let's talk about this in terms of my face-to-face course. My online students, it's a little different because you're doing more observation. You do get some of these components, but you don't get everything that the face-to-face course gets. But you can see it. You can observe it. So I lecture. Let's talk about this in terms of how my courses are designed. I will give you a 5-question quiz over the major concept of the day. You take that in the first 10 minutes of the class, then I lecture over it. At least I know you've been introduced to it. Even if you haven't watched the video lecture, you're about to get the longer lecturing course. But I try to keep that short enough so that I can also demonstrate. So I lecture, I cover the content, you get some visual aids in that, then I demonstrate. I demonstrate how the activity is linked to the theoretical concept and vice versa. Right? So that's what we talk about. I introduce the activity, and then I say, all right, here's how this activity is connected. This is what I want you to get from it. I facilitate by having the activities already set up, by having the lecture set up, by having the format of the class designed in a way that facilitates the process. I'm not just winging it, right? There's a structure to the class. That's all facilitation. If you look at the activities, often when we go to the other room where the activities are set up, after I've introduced it for you to videotape your experimentation with the activity, the experiential learning part of it, it's been facilitated. I've set it all up for you. You just have to go in and do what I told you to do. Also use cooperative delegate, what's called a cooperative delegator teacher, meaning that I put you in groups so that y'all can interact with each other. You can cooperate. You can have a defined leader. You can delegate responsibilities. You can learn from each other in that group interaction. But you'll notice that every class has experiential learning built into it. Learning from experience. All of those activities allow you to experiment. That is inquiry-based, but it's also experiential learning. Think experiential learning more of what you're learning from yourself, from your failures, from your group activities. That's all experience. Inquiry-based would be closer to what you would see in like a chemistry class, where you have a lab setting and you go actually perform an experience, and the learning occurs from that experimentation. We do the same thing. I lecture over the theoretical concept, but I have an activity for you to apply that theoretical concept to, and then to teach it back to me. So I include or incorporate all those teaching styles. So that way I can make sure that if one teaching style doesn't fit the way that you learn, I'm hitting the big five. So you notice on this line, a lecture is closer to just teacher-centered, meaning this is all about the teacher being the expert in the field, presenting information. But as we move further up the food chain here, we become more student-centered. Like experiential learning is all about the student, right? Not the teacher being the expert in the field. They are. But now the teacher's role is to help them learn from their own experience, from the teacher's experience, and to make sure the students are having experiences in class with the information, so they can learn from their own experience. They can learn from their group's experience. So it's more cooperative. And you notice here, again, review of Bloom's taxonomy. You see Bloom's taxonomy all the way through this lecture. Even though we're talking about teaching styles with experiential learning, we saw the connection to social learning. We're going back to conceptual learning, types of knowledge. But look here, Bloom's taxonomy in the design of the course. Right here, we have teaching style. Again, Bloom's taxonomy. So that is your conceptual learning for the day. I told you conceptual learning was mixed all the way through. I told you Bloom's taxonomy was one of the main theories I used to create my course. And now you can start to see how it's blending into the course, how I've used Bloom's taxonomy, types of knowledge, all the way through the course design. It should start to make more sense now because you've had prior experience with this theory, not just in the last lecture, but now it's repeated. And we talked about it the very first day. I didn't give you a lot of information, but now those prior experiences should be coming together where you can start to see how this is all interconnected. Here's our references. Experiential learning. Cherry, she has some great information. I think her name is Kendra. So go in and look at some of her content. She does a great job of simplifying these educational theories.